there's an astounding teaching that I want to share with you. It's mysterious and something that, even though I'll mention it tonight as part of my message, I'll revisit with the community tomorrow morning during our Torah study as well, because I won't do justice to it this evening in the way that I'm using it, and it deserves more seeping in our hearts and our minds, and the voices of all of those in the community and how they'll understand the teaching. But it's some of an answer to a question, which is, what do we do with all the bitterness that we can't avoid? And I don't mean the kind of bitterness that you can shrug off with a deep breath or a Vipassana session or go to the local, meditation class or turn on Netflix. I'm talking about the bitterness that sticks in your throat, the grief that you can't fix, the injustice that you can't ignore, the heartbreak that won't heal on your own timeline. We all carry it. It shows up in our personal lives, in lost relationships, and in dreams that have been deferred, in regrets that are too late to rewrite. It shows up in the world in wars that drag on, and leaders who betray our hopes, and systems that disappoint us again and again. That's the question. What do we do with that bitterness? The unavoidable. Do we swallow it? Do we pretend it's not there? Do we hope it dissolves on its own? And I'm sure all of you have your own methods, your own answers to that question. And this teaching that I'll offer is another way in, another portal into what might be yet another approach. So after the miracle, I'm just set the scene, after the miracle at the Red Sea, at Yam Suf, the Israelites are riding high. Freedom, freedom. Celebration, songs of triumph. There are dancing minstrels, there are drums. It's a party. But just 3 days later, reality sets in when the Israelites, who have just, of course, walked through water, go looking for water and find nothing but bitter water. They stumble into a place that the Bible calls, the Torah calls it Marah. Marata, Mara is a name. Marah means the bitter place. And there's no mayim, no water, because they're marim, they're bitter. So in this situation with these bitter waters, undrinkable as they are, they cry out to God, which is, of course, their usual way. Vayilonu, they complain, and then they cry out to Moshe, and Moshe cries to God. Vayitzak el Adonai, and Moshe calls out to God, Vayoreu eitz, Vayashlech el hamayim, Vayimteku hamayim, Sham samlo chok u'mishpat, v'sham nisau. God Vayorehu. God shows him the word Vayorehu. It's not Vayirah, like the word to see, lirot. He shows him a tree, and Moshe throws this mysterious tree into the waters, and what happens? What happens? The waters become sweet. The sweet waters. Just take that in. Because wood is bitter. Not all wood, but bitter. Wood is bitter. God shows Moshe a piece of wood, a bitter piece of wood, and says, throw the bitter into the bitter, and it will make it sweet. God sweetens the bitter with the bitter. The solution to the bitterness was not sugar, although notwithstanding Mary Poppins. It wasn't avoidance. It wasn't even transformation in the way that we usually expect things to transform. The bitterness itself became the cure. The roots grow in bitter soil. Let's all say that. Roots grow in bitter soil. The roots that grow in bitter soil, roots that grow in bitter soil. The Ramban Nachmanides writes that the word vayorehu that he showed him the wood is connected to the word teaching, moreh. Vayorehu, he taught him the wood. And according to the tradition of the Nachmanides in the 13th century in Spain, there's a great mystical something going on here, through which he says God taught Moshe the mystery of lahamti kamar im hamar, to sweeten the bitter with the bitter. It sounds almost homeopathic, right? It's like sweetening the bitter with the bitter. Two negatives make a positive. Something is going on here. That the roots that grow in bitter soil is profoundly the story of the celebration of the wisdom of trees and the wisdom that comes with knowing that trees themselves, the very bitter ingredient that sweetened the waters, itself grew in bitter soil. And the strength of the tree is absolutely dependent upon the winds that blow. The strength of the trunk of the tree is directly proportionate to the amount of stress that's been placed upon it. All of this happens every year. This reading of Shabbat Shirah, the story of the Song of the Sea, and then the result in bitter waters is always read around the time of Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of Trees, when we celebrate the growth and the renewal and the deep roots. The healing agent is a tree, a living symbol of resilience. Resilience born of trial and difficulty. The roots grow in bitter soil. A tree doesn't grow because conditions are perfect, but it grows because it digs deep. It finds nourishment even in rocky and bitter soil. And what if that's not just a botanical fact, but a spiritual truth? That the roots grow in bitter soil, that your growth, my growth, doesn't come from avoiding our discomfort and our bitterness. It comes from sinking into it, letting it teach us and shape us and stretch us. There's a story in the New York Times this week that, I don't know if anybody saw it, but about an evangelical pastor named Bill White, whose son Timothy came out as gay when he was quite young, 13, 15. And his father, who is an evangelical pastor and had somewhat on the smaller side of a mega church, and he was a deeply religious man and kept extensive journals of his own inner terrain, his own inner stories each and every day. He gave permission to his son Timothy to publish those journals, entries, around the time that Timothy came out to his dad. And what ensues in a very beautiful way, if you get a chance to see it, a very moving way, was a window into a man of faith, an amazing father, a loving father. And more importantly, for the bitter, is someone who didn't walk away from the discomfort that revelation gave him, but stayed with it, even though things got more and more bitter, and he knew they would be. He knew that as he wrestled with his love of his son and reconciling his faith and his theology, the inerrancy of Scripture and what it means, and feeling God calling him into a relationship of love with his son and his newfound identity. By the way, parenthetically, poignantly, the story begins with the earliest memory that Timothy had of his father standing in the doorway praying for his son and his son's future wife. And as his father, as Bill White, this amazing story, he's wrestling with this bitter truth, bitter to him, obviously, not bitter to Timothy. You see a man wrestling and inviting in the bitterness. He doesn't run from it, he doesn't avoid it. He allows its searing nature to change him. And his greatest strength is that he is transformed by it. He is not the same afterwards. He ultimately keeps his faith, but his faith has completely changed. His theology is different. It's a beautiful story at a time when not too many people are changing their hearts and their minds about pretty much anything, about the possibility of that transformation, because the roots grow in bitter soil. Think about maror, the bitter herb that we eat on Pesach to remind us of slavery, to taste the bitterness on purpose. We don't eat it alone. Of course, we dip it into charoset, the sweetness, right? But first, we let it sit and seep and become even more bitter before we finally sweeten it. We don't cancel bitterness. We don't pretend it isn't real. Both are part of the story. Bitterness is not the enemy. It's one of our ingredients. It says to us that roots grow in bitter soil. So looking around at the world today and thinking about sermons for this weekend, celebratory song of the sea, liberation, it can feel, for many of us, like it slips sliding away. The crisis in Gaza, political systems that are still fragile, leaders who propose solutions that make us shake our heads and clench our fists. There's a lot of bitterness now, and we are all thirsting for waters that will quench our need for meaning, clarity, purpose, a sense of what to do next. And I hope to God that all of us in our own ways are finding those answers. But for me, the answer right now is not in any kind of quick fix or a false comfort, but that in knowing that sometimes when God wants to sweeten waters, first it will get a lot more bitter before it sweetens. And I have to keep asking myself, do I have the strength to remember that roots grow in bitter soil and that something intense is happening to me and to all of us that is changing us, that is shaping us, that is inviting us to not run from but run towards this. And as we enter this Shabbat of the Song of the Sea and this week of the trees and the songs of the tree, I'm reminded that the Torah tells us, Ki Adam hu eitz hasadeh, that all of us are trees. So to be a tree, to be rooted in both joy and heartbreak at this moment, to be rooted in success and struggle, to remember that my roots, even if I can't see it at this moment, are growing in bitter soil. That's what it feels like to me at this moment to be a man of faith, to be a person of faith. I'd be remiss not to be, as I've always been for 18 years here in the shul, very transparent. And in that way, hoping that we're all together as humans, struggling in our own ways and succeeding in others. I couldn't stop thinking about this teaching of having bitterness used to add to bitterness for sweetness to emerge when I was driving this week to see a family member that I love very much who struggles and is struggling. And how often that thought comes into my mind, what is the point of this bitterness that he, they, we have to endure? And there's a danger in this perspective. At what point is it too bitter? At what point do you say, you know what, I'm waiting for it to sweeten, and I've been waiting for 50 years? At what point do you say, you know what, enough with the bitter on the bitter. That's the way you work in the world, God. Me, I want to put the charoset on right away. I can only handle this much bitterness. And then this teaching came to my heart. And I heard a voice say in me that one of the ways that God works in the world is to help us hold that bitterness that won't go away, that unavoidable bitterness, is not to take it away, but to deepen it for a while so that we have a greater capacity, a stronger trunk, that we become in some way more rooted more clear in what our convictions are, more resolute in what we must fight for and protest for, that it sharpens this blade and makes us more available to be agents of liberation, agents of justice, agents of goodness and peace. So what will you do with the bitterness that you've been given? I hope that you won't run from it. I hope that you won't drown in it either. But I hope, most of all, that you will root in it, because roots grow in bitter soil. I'm so curious if some of you will come tomorrow morning as I share this teaching and its many different expressions through the last some 1,500 to 2,000 years in the rabbinic sources, and maybe you'll add your Torah to how adding the bitter sometimes to the bitter deepens and sweetens